If I don't think about the future and all that I care about is what I'm doing right now, that could become dangerous.
That's Tom Chermack. He's not your typical scenario planning expert. He's professor at Colorado State University, where he is founder and director of the Scenario Planning Institute. He is also founder and principal of Chermack Scenarios, where he offers scenario planning services for organizations. He has authored 2 influential books on scenario planning in organizations and using scenarios. And these books solidified his status as one of the foremost thinkers in scenario planning.
If you hire one of the big consulting firms, they come in, do their analysis, and then give you the plan. If you view your work as to make a set of scenarios and give it to a client, I think you've done half the work.
As we explore the realm of scenario planning with Tom, we have the privilege to get insights from a genuine expert and pioneer in this field. In this video, you'll discover Tom's workshop-based scenario process, the distinctive challenges and benefits associated with workshop-based and expert-driven approaches, and a shift towards a kind of design sprint scenario planning. Tom's journey in scenario planning began in the early 2000s as a student, and since then he's honed his skills and gained lots of insights in scenario planning. Tom, you have a profound connection to the Japanese culture, and particularly through your interest and your appreciation of the tea ceremony. And also you have an interest in Buddhism. And Buddhism often emphasizes the here and now, so living in the moment. How do you reconcile this philosophy of being in the moment in Buddhism with your job as a scenario planner when you think strategically about the future?
It's an excellent question, one that I think about quite a bit, actually. And I suppose there's an element here of thinking about the connection between maybe more my personal life and my professional life. But I don't see that there's quite a lot really to reconcile. So while I'm very interested in the concepts of Buddhism, the idea that the present moment is really all we have, even in my personal life, I think about whatever choices I make in the present determine what options I have available in the future. The decisions we make in the present moment necessarily determine paths available to you in the future. And so I guess that would be the connection I would make. If I don't think about the future and all that I care about is what I'm doing right now, that could become dangerous without regard for behaviors now, actions you take now, and the effects that they may or could have. I think that's something to be careful about. For example, if you have a company that's only interested in short-term profit, and they're not thinking at all about sustainability or what happens to their products when they've reached the end of their life or something like this. That's what I mean when I say the danger. There are things happening right now today that if we're not paying attention to that and only daydreaming into the future, it may have the same potential negative consequences.
Tom, you went from an undergrad student with an interest in scenarios to a world-renowned expert in scenario and strategic scenario planning. Could you share some insights into the journey that you've taken?
Yes, and thank you for that. I don't really often think of myself as expert in anything, but the story, it was the late 1990s, and I was an undergraduate student, as you mentioned, and it was one night I was in a strategy course, and the professor, it was one evening in a 16-week course or whatever it was, when she talked about scenarios and having had an experience with that. This faculty member was from South Africa and was there during some of the Adam Kahane work on scenarios for the future of South Africa right around the end of apartheid. So I was immediately intrigued, and I think what really got me hooked was scenarios really do require a combination of really deeply analytical thinking and then also really speculative, creative thinking. So blending those two together, and I had never heard of strategy talked about that way before. So it really was the first time that the idea of thinking about multiple futures in a business planning context ever hit my ears. And I mean, that night I decided, like, this is something I really need to explore. So of course, immediately I started looking, because I had made a decision that I wanted to become an academic. There were only a couple of books out at the time. We had Peter Schwartz, The Art of the Long View. We had Kees van der Heyden's Art of Strategic Conversation, some of Ringland's work. And these were all coming from essentially Shell alumni. And so when I looked at the academic literature, there was really hardly anything there at all on scenarios specifically. So that also sparked my mind to think, I want to be an academic, and here's a research agenda that could last the rest of my career, is to try to build some evidence, because these books are all claims from essentially former practitioners. And I thought, I can't find any evidence for the claims that scenarios help you make better decisions, the claims that scenarios improve your culture, and these kinds of things. So I thought there's a huge opportunity to really kind of try the best I could to fill in the evidence side of things. I also had a mentor who was very challenging, in the sense that he said to me that it wasn't acceptable to just sit in my university office and write and think about stuff. So he always pushed me to say, you got to figure out how to do this. You got to have one foot in practice. And so it was right when I finished my doctoral work that I started Chermac Scenarios. And I've been working with various companies ever since. It's been a pretty wild ride. It's been a lot of fun.
How did you transition from researching scenario planning in your thesis to actually practicing it? You mentioned having a mentor during your postgraduate studies. Did he provide you with any guidance, or did you have to learn everything from scratch?
It's something I started from scratch. My mentor was also obviously a professor, and he worked very heavily in the area of training and development. He came out of kind of vocational education, how to help people learn their jobs, back in the 60s and 70s, and really, really contributed some really groundbreaking work in how people learn on the job, and that kind of realm. So he was very much familiar with having a foot in practice and one at the university. So that was the major motivation. But he was not steeped in the scenarios world. So at his prompting, I can remember literally begging companies as a graduate student to let me come and try this out. As I mentioned, there were so few resources at the time, and none of them really gave a clear description of the process. I mean, there were hints. So it was really trying to put it together with not a lot of guidance. And it was a lot of trial and error, that's for sure.
I'm actually in a position quite similar to where you were 20 years ago. So I'm developing my own workshops. I'm trying to develop my own facilitation style. So I'd love to hear about the challenges and roadblocks you encountered on the way and how you solved these. Could you share any experiences where you tried new things and things just didn't quite work out? And I know this is taking you a few years into the past, but I think many of our viewers will be in a similar situation as me and would benefit from your insights.
I can remember thinking about, as I mentioned, just trying to recruit companies. I wasn't charging fees. I was just saying, through other graduate students who were maybe steeped in a given company, I would, ask them if I could come and try this out. And things like, you learn very quickly, like who participates in scenario, in whatever workshops you're doing, really matters. Who's there? Learning to read signals about how do you make, like, this very common that you might encounter a very dominant voice in a group of, managers, leaders, executives, whatever. So how do you deal with that when one person is really dominating the conversation? Those were things that it took me a bit to figure out like what's the best way to select people who participates, and trying to learn to communicate upfront that this is a very dialogue based process and it can get contentious. People have different points of views, and really thinking deeply about, essentially kind of warning the clients that, if you ideally you want people to come to this kind of activity with an open mind, feeling free to disagree, but all still being friends at the end of the day. So an ability to be open-minded and disagree was something like thinking about how do you select for that was a big challenge and learning early on for me.
Do you have the opportunity to select your clients? So for instance, have there been cases where you've said an organization isn't quite ready to engage in scenario planning at the moment, and that they needed to work on their mindset and their culture before undertaking such a scenario process?
Yes, it's interesting you asked that, because one of the kind of current topics, so now we'll jump to today. I do think there's a big space in exactly what you asked, like the readiness for participating in scenario planning. I don't know the answer to this question, and I don't know exactly what it could look like, but it seems like there could be kind of like a pre-assessment of, I don't know if I want to say personality characteristics, but some way to judge that whoever's going to come and participate has this kind of open-mindedness, or at least willing to have disagreements and essentially not take everything terribly personally. And I don't want to highlight, like, that's actually somewhat rare that anything really chaotic happens, at least in my experience. But I think there is a space to develop that sort of entry phase to scenarios. Like, is your group ready? Is your organization ready? There could be resources the organization might need to have, and certain desirable characteristics of participants. So at the moment, usually the project sponsor or stakeholder, often the CEO or senior manager, will reach out to me, and we talk about all of these things to some high level. And eventually I will get a suggested participant list and look through and see who's coming. And those are very candid conversations. Like, I'll just straight out ask, is there anyone coming who, might be really a dominant person? And so I've learned to get more upfront information on that. But I always rely on that project sponsor to give me a list. And I always have a look at it before we get anybody together, and check some of those things the best that I can.
So a significant aspect of your work is facilitation. You lead workshops, make sure that everyone contributes and that everyone's input is equally heard. Can you tell us a little bit more on how you developed your facilitation skills? Was it a matter of trial and error, or did you have particular training in facilitation before you engaged in the scenario planning?
So before I ever got into scenarios, before that fateful night as an undergraduate, I was working in training and development, and I was working for, I think it was Anderson Consulting at the time, literally doing stand-up training on various topics. So I had some prior experience with being up in front of a group and facilitating, but I think facilitation is absolutely one of the most critical skills, not just for scenarios or futures or foresight, but I think generally speaking, as we move into the future, and we'll get to this, I'm sure, but things like AI, I just don't think it can replace good facilitation. I could be wrong about that. There's two major different approaches to scenarios, and one is the more workshop-based approach where you're facilitating and there's participants. The other is more, I would say, behind the scenes. For example, I worked with a large global mining company, and we just didn't have the ability to get everyone together. The participants were dispersed all across the globe. And so we interviewed about 24 people. And then me and my team wrote the scenarios off of that interview data and off of our own research on the mining industry. So that's just, there's a difference there. But if you're using the workshop approach to scenarios, it's absolutely critical that it be an engaging experience. And there are things that come up, and how do you deal with, dominant people and quiet people as well? And how do you incorporate as much of everyone's view as possible? It's never, I don't think it's achievable to have 100% of everyone's thoughts go into that. There's always going to be a negotiation there. But yes, facilitation skills are really important for the workshop approach to scenario.
Earlier, you mentioned two approaches to developing scenario. One, a more workshop-based process where you work with the clients in developing scenarios. And the other one where you develop the scenarios independently and then present them to the client. Could you share your preferences between those two approaches and what the advantages and disadvantages are of each approach?
I do generally prefer the workshop approach, just because I'm also a professor. I love the interaction. I love the dialogue. I love watching people's faces change when they have an insight, and you know as a facilitator that because of this experience, they've just reperceived something in a way that they didn't see it before we did this exercise. So I do prefer that. The challenge with the workshop approach is always, in my experience, it's always time. How many people? How many trips are we getting people together? And I'll say more about that as we move on. And it's just a resource issue of, if you're going to get 20 people together, where are they? How much does it cost for travel? All of that stuff. And to get people together multiple times just gets incredibly expensive. So I've been working on a solution to that. So those are the main challenges I see there, and I do prefer that approach. The other approach, where you sort of go away, is really inspired by Pierre Vac. I don't know if you've come across his work, but at Shell, he was head of scenario planning, and the committee of managing directors would say to him, "We have this problem. We don't know what to do. There's uncertainty here." And he had his team. I think it grew as large as about 52 people at one point. And he would take them to really inspiring locations to get this group together, and they would debate things out, develop these scenarios, and then he would take them back to the managing directors and present them. So there wasn't like a workshop approach involving the managing directors. He and his team hashed it out and created these scenarios. The advantages to that are, of course, just that you have maybe a little bit more time to think deeply. You can put a team together. He had really radically different people from all kinds of ethnic and cultural backgrounds. So that's a really fun way to think about building scenarios, in that you have your choice of who would really have something interesting to say about this. And that became sort of legendary. He called them remarkable people. And after Peter Schwartz later left Shell and started a global business network, they had it was a really important part of their business model, was remarkable people, a network across the world that they could pull from for scenario work just about anywhere. So of course there's pros and cons to both, and using that second approach of sort of going away and working on your scenarios a little bit behind the scenes. The one thing that I've found that the biggest challenge there, in my experience, is you don't necessarily know what the ultimate client is expecting, and their input and their views. So the only way you can get that is to interview them ahead of time as input. So that's incredibly important if they're not participating and engaging in some kind of dialogue about the future.
I'm sure our viewers would love to get an inside look into your typical process when working with clients. Could you walk us through your process? What are the key steps or elements you consider in this process?
Generally speaking, there's all the kind of contracting phase. How many people, what's the location going to be? Are we going to do this workshop, or would you prefer that we just interview and we do the scenarios on our side? Once all of that gets sorted out, the main phases are these. First, the first piece is interviews. I always do interviews with, not an excessive number, maybe 5 or 6 people from the participant list. And that gives you a little window into the mindsets of some of the participants who you'll meet. It gives you a lot of industry background information, like you're already getting up to speed on what are the big things that they worry about, what do they see as the major challenges coming up. So it's just a way to ramp up learning a new industry or company that if I haven't worked with them before. So first phase is interview. Assuming we're doing the workshop approach, then the second piece is what I generally call workshop 1. So I generally work with the 2x2 matrix approach, which you might have become familiar with, but it's brainstorming, it's ranking on impact, ranking on uncertainty, and all of that work to isolate a couple of what we call critical uncertainties. So these are the dynamics that can dramatically change our industry, and we really have no idea how they're going to play out over the next, whatever the time span is. So once you get the matrix, all of that is done in workshop 1, the way that I approach it. The next phase is literally writing scenarios. So you've got to take all of that information, the interviews, the workshops, the sticky notes, all of it, and craft a narrative scenario or a set of narrative scenarios. So then once that part is finished, then the next piece is going back to the client and saying, here are your scenarios. And this is really important to me, and I'm not quite clear about how other scenario planners might do this. But for me, it's never enough just to give them back the scenarios. So that third phase is we give them the scenarios, but we ask them to do something with the scenario. So it could be as simple as, here's scenario 1. If I could predict this is the future that's coming, what would you do now? And then we repeat that process for the other scenarios. So it's a very elementary, very qualitative approach, but it's a very common one in my experience. My clients seem to really want that. So that's the major steps or phases of the projects, the way that I work on them. If I have had clients that were longer term, there's all kinds of follow-on ways we can use the scenarios to look at the business model, the finance structure, all these various things. So there's really unlimited opportunities if the client is interested in taking the work further. But so I say as a minimum, interviews, workshop 1, writing the scenarios, coming back and asking them to do something and react to the scenario.
I'm quite intrigued by the second step of your process, the actual writing of the scenario narrative. Do you do that within the workshop with participants?
We have a very defined process in which we literally use all of those sticky notes from the brainstorming and the ranking, right? All of that goes into an Excel sheet. And it's really important we do that verbatim. So we take their sticky notes verbatim and put them into an Excel workbook. And from there, once, when we have completed the matrix, so we've got kind of 4 scenario spaces, we can start populating those quadrants, just generally speaking, with some of those sticky notes. And there's a more detailed process maybe I don't need to go into, but we do all of that on my side. Me and my team take all of those stickies, we craft these scenarios. And what I found that does for us is pretty much every single workshop, when we go to that third phase of feeding the scenarios back, every single time we hear the comments like, I can see my thoughts. Like, how did you do this? I can see, well, you gave it to us. So it's just a matter of putting it in there. I will totally agree that if the participants are involved in writing the scenarios, there is no question in my mind that their ownership of the scenarios will increase. And that's just a natural psychology of having them participate in writing these stories. The thing that I have also noticed is if they don't participate, in writing the scenarios. Now you have a surprise when you eventually do go back to them and say, here's a scenario. It's based on all the information you gave us. And maybe we took some creative license to embellish things a little bit or throw some things unexpected into the scenarios. But when you show them that scenario, it's really intriguing to watch people read them if they haven't seen them before. Because you sort of get this impact of, wow, I didn't think about this. And that I find is to me a really powerful approach. And it's just what I have found to be effective. It's like, I think you can actually see people's mental models changing when they encounter a scenario for the first time and they don't know what it's going to say.
Can we effectively combine these two methods to allow for collaborative scenario creation while still introducing an element of surprise for the clients?
I've experimented with that. So, there are different options. So one option is to have the whole participant group, maybe you divide them up into, 4 groups of 5 people if you've got 20 or whatever, and each group works on a scenario or something like this. The other option that I've experimented with is, so we write the scenarios on my side, but we give them to like maybe 2 or 3 people from the whole participant group, and they give us feedback just to check, like, is there anything factually incorrect or just tweaks that they might have? And that seems to work relatively well if you have the time. And then, of course, the third option is nobody gets to see them, and it's full on, like, here you go, here's the scenario, and react to it.
So if I understand correctly, you primarily use the third option, or maybe a combination of the second and third option. Can you tell us a little bit more how that plays out in practice?
Mostly the third option, and I'd like to say a little bit more about why, if I could. Every company does strategic planning, and often it's kind of an annual 2-day exercise. So I have come to the belief, I think every organization should be using scenarios. And so over the years, I have heard there's criticisms of scenarios, and there are 2 false assumptions. Number one, scenarios take forever, 6-8 months to develop, which is not true. And number 2, scenario planning is really expensive and it requires multiple workshops over multiple months, which is also not true. So particularly in the last 5, 7, 8 years, I have developed like it's sort of like the minimum viable product. And because I'm trying to do everything I can to position scenarios as an accessible and reasonable effort, we can do it in 3 days. So we do interviews up front, we go to the site, we facilitate the workshop, get all the stickies. The next day we literally write the scenarios in a day. And then day 3, we bring them back and say, react to this. What would you do if I could predict this is your future? And then repeat that process. It's taken me a long time to get that efficient.
I bet.
But it's absolutely doable. Now, the drawback to that, of course, if you're writing scenarios in 1 day, there's limitations, right? Like you don't get an opportunity to really dive into deep research, whereas if you had a few weeks to develop them, or in some cases months, there's a limitation there. Obviously, the scenarios would be more rigorous, more robust if you had more time to work on them. So that's really kind of my standard approach at the moment.
In your recent book, Using Scenarios, you emphasize the importance of measuring the effectiveness of scenario planning. But in the book, you seem to convey a sense of frustration when scenarios don't fulfill their potential. Could you talk more about the typical obstacles that organizations face when translating scenarios into actionable strategies?
It's a tricky question, and I hope that writing that book, I hope that other scenario planners out there have other ideas, because I'm not saying this is a definitive list of ways to use scenarios or how to think about success or not success. So I think just to back up, I mentioned this earlier, the using scenarios part is is built into my approach. So I don't, it's a requirement of my clients to have at least that third day where we're feeding them back the scenarios and asking them to do something with them. So for me, it's not negotiable. That part has to be included. So again, I think if you view your work as to make a set of scenarios and give it to a client, I think you've done half the work. And I think we're in jeopardy as a field of the same problems with strategic planning. So if you hire one of the big consulting firms, they come in, do their analysis, and then give you the plan. If that's the end, you're not even going to be able to talk about success. So you have to get to the use before you can start thinking about success. So that was the motivation for the book. I didn't necessarily intend it to come across as frustration, but I wanted to be very, very clear that, I mean, the tagline that I use in the book is having scenarios doesn't mean anything if you don't know how to use them. And I think I said very clearly, or I tried to say very clearly, that latest book is picking up with an assumption you have a set of scenarios. So it is agnostic in terms of how you got your scenarios. Doesn't matter which method, doesn't matter which approach. The starting point is we have a set of scenarios. Now, what can we do with them? And so I try to outline, I think there's 7 different ways to use scenarios. So that was like step 1. I wanted to put something out there, and I hope others will react to that and add to it and make it better. Your other question about measurement and success, I mean, it's really difficult. It's really difficult. There's a chapter in there, and this is my thinking. One, the best way that I can think of right now of how to think about success is you have to have done a scenario project. You have to have helped a client use them to think about something. You can vet decisions through the scenarios. Is this a good decision? Is this a good decision? In that scenario, this scenario. And then some time has to go by because the client has to make a decision. And so I think it makes sense that really, in retrospect, is a good way to think about scenario success. So let me give you an example. Last year, there was a company I was working with. One of the major decisions they were facing was they were thinking about acquiring a small company. And so we did the scenarios, we made the scenarios, and we put that decision in each scenario. Well, it turned out in each of the scenarios, it was like, this is a really risky, maybe not a good decision. Okay? And so some time went by, so they decided not to acquire this company. And about 6 months later, this little company, well, no, I don't know how little it is, went bankrupt because there was unethical financial practices happening. And so the CEO of the company that I was working with, when I had a follow-up with her, she said, I estimate we saved about $25 million by not buying this company because of the scenario project. Because we were all, thinking, yeah, let's buy this company. And sort of showing your work and saying, really? They decided not to do it. And then the outcome was what it was. And I think that's the kind of way that I can best think about, in some ROI or monetary sense, evaluating the success. It has to be tied to decisions that are made, but those only happen sometime after the scenario work is sort of done, if you will. And then you need time to see what the outcomes were. And it can only be, in my mind, estimated sort of in retrospect is I guess my best thinking on that at the moment.
Yeah, well, that comes down to how we define success. I think success and failure in scenario planning is quite nuanced. And it's not solely about whether a scenario will eventually unfold or not. To me, it's more about the value that we derive, or that organizations derive, from the process itself. The discussions that are had, the decisions that are being made, the assumptions about the future that appear in the scenario planning process. And that goes beyond a quantitative return on investment and is more to do with a cultural shift within an organization?
I have been trying to measure certain softer benefits of scenario planning. So, for example, we've shown in some of my research that scenario planning, this exercise, can promote uh, a learning organization culture. You know, one that embraces learning, promotes learning. I mean, that's a and then by proxy, there are studies that show an increased learning culture does have direct firm performance ROI links. So it's sort of like if we can use the scenarios to promote learning, and we know that learning can improve performance, it's sort of that chain of causation, I hope, or at least influence. Other things I've studied, decision-making styles. We've shown scenarios change the way people make decisions going through this process. Mental models change, assumptions about the view of the organization change, climate, organizational climate changes, employee engagement changes, all in positive directions. So there's increasing evidence that there are these kind of softer benefits to using this process, as you mentioned.
Tom, I'm curious, how does this mindset influence your approach when working with clients? So do you actively incorporate activities that lead towards an intervention and a cultural shift, if you want? Or are these elements that happen naturally within the scenario planning process?
One client I've worked with a couple of times has wanted to use the process because he saw the team building aspect. So he got all of his SVPs together from different regions. We did the 3-day version, and he saw immediately like the knowledge sharing that happens, the connection across different divisions in different parts of the world. Like, I can't tell you how many times I hear the phrase something like, I didn't even know that we do that in this company. So there really is knowledge sharing that happens. And so I know for a fact that some of my clients have used it more specifically to kind of create a team culture and to share knowledge across these different functions and things like that. But I don't think it's ever been explicitly stated at the kind of entry or contracting phase. We want to use this to build a culture.
You've mentioned the difficulties of engaging participants in scenario planning workshops, particularly geographic and time constraints. Have you transitioned to online workshops to overcome these obstacles and to ensure broader participation in the workshops?
First of all, that's one motivation for the 3-day kind of approach, because we only have to get people together once, and we can do everything we need to do to make the scenarios. We can write them and we can show them back to you and talk about strategy and stuff like that. We can do it that quickly. Certainly appropriate to ask questions about the quality of that because it's so fast, but we can do it. During COVID, I had no choice. I had to take the whole process online, and it's just, it's so incredibly difficult to replicate a sticky note brainstorming exercise in an online environment. I tried. I used things like Miro, which is an online sticky note board, but having 20 people in there moving stuff around, like it just, we made it work, but there is no question in my mind that the face-to-face experience, particularly with scenarios, is just, I don't believe it's replicable in an online environment. Sometimes there's kind of a hybrid version. This has happened a few times where we got a client group together in a location. We did the first workshop, and then everybody went home. We wrote the scenarios within a week, and we had an online version of that 3rd day, which is easier because you just give them the scenario, put them in breakout groups, and ask them to react to that scenario. So that part is, it can be a little bit hybrid. I still prefer people together in a room. All of the break time conversations, all of the subtle social interactions are just so incredibly important.
How do you envision the field of scenario planning in terms of new emerging technologies like generative AI, for instance?
Well, there's no question in the last year, AI is on every, sticky note brainstorming exercise when it wasn't before, I'd say, a year and a half ago.
Mm-hmm.
So clearly, AI is going to be a factor that everyone is considering and thinking is potentially highly uncertain. So that is definitely coming to the top of the list of implications. The other way to think about AI is, I think, Spaniel and Roland put out a paper, maybe it's close to a year ago. They were right on the edge of it, and they described using ChatGPT to generate scenarios.
Mm-hmm.
So now we're already at the place where I suppose I have to face the facts that if a client comes to me and says, we're thinking about scenarios, one thing I could say is, with a little bit of back and forth with ChatGPT, you can have it generate 3, 4, 5, 6 scenarios. You give it what industry, you give it some input, and it will do it for you. So that's interesting to think about. But if what people really want is kind of that team building, that culture building, and they want their leaders in the organization to learn to think differently, ChatGPT is not going to replace that learning experience, in my view. I should not be so definitive. I think it would be difficult for ChatGPT to replace the workshop experience, the dialogue, the conversation, and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So that's an interesting part of the future of scenarios. The other thing I think one of your questions you might have wanted to ask was about advice for young people who maybe want to enter this space. And I really think there's a huge opportunity, but it's really difficult right now. Like, where do you go if you want to learn scenarios? So in preparation for this, I've just been searching around, and you can go to an online 2-day workshop at Harvard. Columbia Business School has one. Michigan has one. UT Austin has one. And that might be enough to get you started. So these kinds of things are out there. My strong recommendation would be to do something face-to-face, get to know people. I think the optimal solution is to find a mentor who can show you through real scenario projects, which leads me to say the one place that I think is just really at the top of the game right now is the Oxford Scenarios program.
Mm-hmm.
So Rafael Ramirez, Trudy Lang, Cho Kong, and Cynthia Celine are all top-notch, and they've been running that program for something 20 years. It's a 5-day, week-long intensive training program. They have live clients that come in and give you a real organizational problem to build scenarios around. But other than that, we really don't have. I will give a shameless plug. We are going to run our first scenarios training program in April 2024.
Mm-hmm.
So we're planning that, trying to get that up and running. And it seems like there's a big market of people that might want to learn about this. So we'll definitely look forward to that. Anyone who wants to get into this field, you've got to find a way to learn as much as you can about it. And we're going to do it in Oregon. And we're going to have world-class chefs. It's going to be this beautiful retreat on the Metolius River. So, yeah, I really want to make it a unique, kind of in that spirit of Pierre Vac, kind of going to a beautiful place, because we know that influences strategic and creative thinking. So, yeah, I'm really excited about trying to get that to come together.
That sounds like a great learning experience for the viewers that are interested in participating in such a program. Where can I find more information?
I would say connect with me on LinkedIn.
Thank you very much, Tom, for sharing your insights and your experiences with us today. It's been incredibly valuable, and I have a lot to think about. I made lots of notes. There are things that I need to incorporate into my own practice. It's been a truly enlightening conversation. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, and I hope it was useful to some folks out there. Everybody should be using scenarios.